It's been about 8 months since then Judge Brett Kavanaugh was questioned by Congress about not only his professional credentials for the Supreme Court, but an allegation of sexual assault. Now, a report released last month by the Perryundem Research Firm asked a politically and ethnically diverse group of 1,300 men and women about the immediate, short, and long-term impacts of those hearings. For context and reaction to the report, I spoke to Professors Kenneth Tucker Jr. of Mount Holyoke College and Carrie Baker of Smith College.
First of all, the report found that 57% of people did not believe Brett Kavanaugh when he denied the charges of sexual assault that Blasey Ford made. And what was also interesting about the report was that it made people think a lot more about gender and political representation and power. They were more likely to think of the need for more women in public office and women's perspectives in public office.
And 76% of respondents, it was about 1,300 people they polled in this for these findings. 76% of people said that they saw men and women as equally adept at representing people in office. But that's not how we see the reality in who is elected. So I thought that was pretty interesting too.
Yeah, I mean, that number had gone significantly up because historically people have thought women have not been as politically capable to be leaders. And so I think this event made people realize that we need more women in public office. And with Democratic women, actually, it made them think that women were more capable public leaders. So that was an interesting finding.
And we may have seen that bear out in the midterm elections as well. We'll talk about that in a minute. Professor Tucker, though, I want to get your overall reaction to the findings.
Well, I too believe that this was an interesting study that saw that there's a wide divergence in the way, especially Republican men, understand these issues of sexual assault and sexual harassment. I found it very interesting that all the demographic groups were moving in the direction of favoring or believing the women who come forward with allegations of sexual assault or sexual harassment, except for Republican men who moved in the other direction. And what really struck me was how I think these Republican men were really politicized by the Kavanaugh hearings, in the sense that these issues became part of a kind of political partisan divide once the Kavanaugh hearings happened, because most Republican men believed Kavanaugh. And one of the things that Kavanaugh stated was that the Clintons and the Democratic Party and a left-wing conspiracy was behind these allegations against him.
When he spoke in his testimony, you're referring to.
Exactly. And I think this fits in with a lot of the feelings of Republican men to kind of generalize how they view the world, and we're primarily talking about white men here.
Yeah, I think an important point is that there was a real split between Republican men and Republican women. And this is the first time that this kind of difference has shown up, where Republican women were moving more towards being sympathetic to people reporting sexual assault, whereas Republican men were moving against. So really, Republican men were the only demographic that weren't pushed in a direction of believing victims, of being concerned about the lack of women in political representation. Really, the outliers were the Republican men, but they did go further to the right.
Right, they did go further to the right.
And the report doesn't get into this, but in your opinion, do you have any sense of why?
Well, I think for me it fits in with this kind of notion that many Republican men have, that white men especially are really the victims of society now, that we live in a liberal culture that privileges the concerns of women, of people of color, that it's not unusual for white men to feel that they're unfairly accused of being racist or sexist. And I think politicians like Donald Trump really play on this and promote this idea that white men are suffering because of the kind of advances of people of color and women and other groups like that. So it's not all that surprising to me. I think it fits in with this kind of victim narrative that a lot of white men have now.
But do you think that's a new belief, a new narrative, or a narrative that's always been there, but people feel more comfortable now speaking about it because of President Trump, as you say?
Yeah, I would agree with that they do feel more comfortable speaking about it. And I think the Kavanaugh hearings, like I said, kind of crystallized this idea for many Republican men, that it's okay to talk about these issues, and it kind of validated their feelings of victimhood to some degree.
I mean, white men have been claiming reverse discrimination for decades, but I do think that it has, there's a circling of the wagons at this point, because I think it is becoming socially unacceptable to sexually assault. The Me Too movement has been a major factor in holding men accountable for sexual assault. And I think that for men that feel entitled to that power and to that privilege of being able to, get sexual access when they want it, according to Donald Trump, grab them by the you-know-what, I think that they feel like they're losing some power and they don't like it. And I think that that power is being challenged.
But interestingly, too, the report found that 1 in 3 voters feel less tolerant of sexism in their own life. So you've got about a third or 1 in 3 saying this. But then they also say that sexism is a big problem. Mm-hmm. So people are feeling like they're free to express that point of view as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that all of the events, Donald Trump's election, the Access Hollywood tape, the Me Too movement, and the Kavanaugh hearings have mobilized people to speak out about sexual assault and about imbalance of power. And I think that the result of that mobilization were the 2018 elections, where women and people of color were elected to the House of Representatives in record number. I think this will continue. I think there's a lot of political organizing and mobilization by people that really want to change the status quo. I think, on the other hand, people in power are, again, circling the wagons to resist that change. And so that's where we are.
I agree. I think we're in a kind of very politically polarized environment. So while these attempts at progressive reform are going to occur, I think there's going to be a lot of reaction against it. I don't see much dialogue between these extremes. And I would point out that to kind of look at this from the perspective of Republican men and men in general, I think there's been a kind of cultural erosion of what it means to be a man, that with the decline of manufacturing jobs in the United States, especially working class men are no longer primary breadwinners. They no longer feel that their authority is unquestioned. They feel often disrespected. And I think there's a kind of crisis of identity for men. What does it mean to be a man? And then along comes Donald Trump, who's almost a caricature of conventional masculinity. And he's someone who performs masculinity very, very easily. He's very sure of himself. He's very, very dominant. He says things that are insensitive without thinking twice about it. And I think for men who are a little unsure about what it means to be a man, this is, especially white men, this is a kind of model that's attractive to them.
Although I do think it's like the most negative version of masculinity. And he's a bully. He's
Exactly.
a bully and he's a liar. And, I think for a lot of men, that's not a good model of masculinity. And there's a lot of better ones out there, that people like Donald Trump disregard and say negative things about. And I think that, there are a lot of men that don't like the way that Donald Trump performs masculinity.
Sure. And I would say even among Republicans, there's a lot of political diversity on this issue.
To both of your points about this partisan divide that we're experiencing, I wonder how it's going to jibe with the fact that the majority of voters who were talked to in this say they see sexism as a problem and want officials to address the issues around women's rights and equality. So what shape is that going to take? If you go for legislation in this very partisan environment, would you get anywhere?
I think where action is happening at the state level. I think there are state level legislators passing laws to try to protect women's rights in light of the potential of the Supreme Court with Brett Kavanaugh eroding women's rights in a whole range of areas, including reproductive rights, but also rights related to sexual harassment and sexual assault. The Trump administration has rolled back Title IX protections against sexual assault on college campuses. The Department of Health and Human Services has rolled back all sorts of reproductive rights and access. So I think that activists on the ground, they're certainly trying to work on those levels, but they're also working at the state level to try to protect women's rights.
You've also seen a kind of reaction against trans rights as well, with the Trump administration rolling back rights for transgender people.
One thing I just want to say also that I thought was really fascinating about the report was that many of the respondents saw the link between male power in society and sexual assault. And they said that men sexually assault to reassert their power, not because they're sexually interested in the target of their harassment or assault. It is to establish and reinforce their power. And that, that was very much of a fringe view 20 years ago. And the fact that a majority of people are now polling saying they think that sexual assault is related to male power and privilege in society and supports that is fascinating to me.